Good evening. It's Mr. Evans. We are still reading The Sugar Creek Gang by Paul Hutchens, and tonight we are starting with Chapter 10. Of course, we didn't get to sleep right away on account of being pretty excited and so tickled we didn't know what to do. I guess that man must have thought poetry was a real ghost, or else Old Man Peddler come to life again, or he wouldn't have been so scared. Anyway, that's what I thought that night while we were going back to Poetry's tent. We'd gotten there just in time, too, for right down in the hole where he'd been digging, we'd found a rusty steel box which must have been buried by Old Man Peddler himself. Of course, as Poetry's pops said while we were all waiting there in the lantern light, waiting for the sheriff to come, and with us boys taking turns holding that steel box in our laps, Barry Boyland will have to prove he is really and truly the old man's nephew before this treasure, or whatever it is, will be given to him. Well, at last Poetry and I were in our cots again, with the same stars looking down at us through the opening in the tent, and with the same wind sighing through the leaves in the maple overhead. And we got sleepier and sleepier, and the next thing we knew, it was morning. Maybe I never told you that if it hadn't been for the gang, I'd have been awfully lonesome. For you see, I didn't have any brothers or sisters, and when you're the only child in the house, you keep wishing and wishing you weren't. I guess I wanted a little brother as much as I wanted anything in the world. Anyway, when I told Poetry goodbye that morning, I couldn't help but think how nice it would be to have just one brother, even if he was littler than me. I was still feeling that way about it when I came up to the back door of our house, carrying my suitcase, just as Pop came hurrying toward the house from the barn, with his teeth shining under his mustache and with the happiest smile on his face you ever saw. First he picked me up in his big strong arms and whirled me around in a circle, crying, "Hurrah, hurrah, Bill Collins," as if he was tickled to death to see me. I thought maybe he'd heard about us catching the robber, and I could hardly wait until we got in the house so I could tell him and Mom. And then all of a sudden I heard a baby crying, and something inside of me just kind of bubbled up like it does when I want to tell Jesus I love him, and I knew that a new baby had come to live with us. "The grandest surprise for you," Pop said, "the grandest brand new baby in the world." And I could see myself having a little brother to play with and not being so lonesome anymore when I was at home. "A brother?" I asked, hoping it wasn't a girl. In fact, I'd made up my mind to be mad if it was, 'cause I wanted a little brother so bad. "It's a girl," the Pop said, "the prettiest, blue-eyed, curly-haired little sister a boy ever had given to him." Pop was so tickled he couldn't keep still. He picked up my suitcase and said, "Come on, Bill Collins, and see our little Charlotte Ann." Now, why in the world I didn't like the name Charlotte Ann, I don't know, but I didn't, and I didn't want a baby sister either. So I hung back, not wanting to go in the house, disappointed too, because I wanted them to be all excited over our catching the robber, supposing of course they'd heard about it. But instead they were making a big fuss over the new baby. I went into the kitchen, but not a step farther. "Well, Bill Collins," Pop said, surprised, "aren't you glad?" The fact was, I wasn't. I didn't like girls very well, I'll have to admit. But I guess Pop understands boys, for he didn't make me go in. He just went in himself, and pretty soon I could hear him and Mom talking about me, and also making funny cooing noises to the baby. He wanted a little brother, Pop said, and Mom answered something I couldn't hear, and then I heard some other woman talking too. Just to be sure I wasn't missing anything, I peeped around the corner of the door and saw that the other woman had on a nurse's uniform, and I decided to go outdoors, which I did. Pop had planted some early potatoes in a special garden down along the orchard next to the road, and they were already up and growing, so I went to the tool house and got the hoe and started hoeing those potatoes without being told to. I stayed mad all morning and wouldn't go into the house at all, and Pop just let me work and work without saying much of anything to me. He was plowing in the field behind our orchard, and I noticed he was whistling and singing all morning, and every half hour or even less, he'd tie the horses up at the fence and go into the house to see the new baby. It looked like I wasn't going to be so important around our house anymore. About 11 o'clock, I began to feel worse and worse, and 2 or 3 times I got mad at myself even, because tears came into my eyes. I felt so sorry for myself, but I began to get awful hungry, and I decided maybe I'd just go in at noon and eat dinner anyway. That is, if they'd even have a plate set for me. Well, just when I was feeling the worst, Dragonfly came along and stopped on the other side of the fence and said, "Hello, Bill." "Hello," I said, without looking up, although my hose slipped and I cut off one of the biggest potatoes in the garden. But I didn't care. I just took my hoe and chopped it to pieces and covered it up and went on hoeing, after wiping the sweat off my forehead with my hand. "What's the matter?" Dragonfly asked. "What you so mad about?" "Nothing," I said, "except I've got a new baby sister." I kept on hoeing. Dragonfly looked kind of glum, and he didn't say a word for a minute. Then he said, "How old is she?" "I don't know," I said. "I'll bet she's ugly," he said. Girls always are when they're little." Say, do you know I didn't like to hear Dragonfly say that? In fact, I resented it. "She's pretty," I said, forgetting that I hadn't even looked at her. "She's got pretty blue eyes and black curls." "Yeah, but she's still a girl, though." I sighed, still disgusted, and said, "Yeah, that's the trouble." "But as soon as she's big enough, you won't have to help with the dishes anymore," he said. That was the first encouraging thing I'd thought of all morning. So I kind of sighed, and since there was a peach tree right close by with a lot of nice shade under it, Dragonfly and I lay down in the grass and talked a long time about different things, mostly about last night in Old Man Peddler. Say, Dragonfly was surprised, and he felt pretty bad to think he hadn't been there to help us catch the robber. We kept on talking until Pop called me to dinner. Then Dragonfly got up and hurried home, suddenly remembering his mom had told him not to come over to my house this morning. It seemed funny for Pop to call me to dinner, when all my life I'd been used to having Mom do it, but then I suppose she had to take care of the new baby. At the table, Pop prayed a little longer than usual, he being so happy on account of me having a little sister. Mom wasn't feeling very well, so she didn't come to the table at all. Besides, she had to take care of the baby. The nurse carried a tray into Mom, and then came back and sat in her place at the table. It didn't seem right to have another woman sitting there, and I got to thinking maybe right after dinner I'd better go in the other room and see Mom anyway. And if the baby was there, just kind of sort of look at it kind of quick without particularly noticing it. Well, pretty soon dinner was over, and I went over to the corner of the dining room where I always kept my straw hat, neither Pop nor the nurse paying any attention to me. Anyway, not so I could notice it. I kept looking at the door to the other room out of the corner of my eye, wanting to go in, and pretending to be having trouble with one of the buckles on my overall suspenders. Then, without hardly knowing I was going to, I sidled into the room. And there was Mom in bed, with the happiest smile on her face you ever saw, and beside her, snuggled real close and kind of lying in the crook of Mom's arm, was the baby. I guess I never did feel so bashful in my life. I stood there holding my straw hat in both hands, looking down at my bare feet. "Come here a minute," Mom said, and I walked over close to the bed and started looking at some roses in a vase on the table. I guess those were the prettiest roses in the world. They were about the color of the goldenrod writing paper we used at school, only the petals were soft like velvet. Pop had sent clear to Australia to get the seed, and he'd grown them himself out in our garden. Say, those yellow roses had the sweetest perfume. Their color made me think of a whole bed of wild fawn lilies, which I'd seen down along the creek only yesterday. I guess the real name for fawn lilies is dog-tooth violet, only Pop says they aren't violets. There were some blue and purple violets right close by that bed of fawn lilies, though. So pretty soon I said to Mom, "Do you think she'd like a bouquet of flowers from down along the creek? Maybe I'll have time to go pick some for her." "I'm sure she would," Mom said, and her face was happier than ever. Honest, I'd never seen Mom so happy in my life, and I could tell by the way she looked at me that she didn't like my little sister a bit better than she did me. In about a minute I was out of doors, climbing over the fence and running like a deer through the woods, following the little footpath to the spring. I was going to pick the biggest bouquet of flowers anybody ever saw for little Charlotte Ann. Well, I was stooping down right in the middle of that bed of fawn lilies when pretty soon I heard somebody coming, and it was Circus. "Hello, Bill," he said. "What you doing?" "Nothing," I said. "I got a new baby sister," and went on picking flowers, suddenly remembering Circus didn't like girls very well. "I thought you wanted a little brother," Circus grunted, as if he was disgusted with me for not getting what I wanted. "She's awful nice," I said. "Black hair and blue eyes, and—" "I got 3 sisters," Circus said, "and they've all got blue eyes. There ain't anything special about blue eyes." Just then he saw a tree he'd never climbed before, and in a jiffy he was halfway up to the first limb. It made me plumb disgusted the way he talked. Whatever made him not like girls anyway, I thought. Pretty soon the whole gang was there except Big Jim, who had to do some work before he could come. "Bill's got a baby sister," Circus called down to the gang from where he was sitting, looking like a chimpanzee there on the first limb of the tree. "Yeah, and she's got blue eyes and long black curls," Dragonfly said, teasing me. "He's picking flowers for her," Poetry said. Even Poetry was teasing me, I thought. They all knew how I wanted a little brother. I just kept on picking flowers, getting madder every minute, and liking my little sister better than ever. "I'll help you," little Jim said. "I'll bet she'll like these," starting to pick some harebells over by a beech tree, on the bark of which all of us boys had carved our initials, it being the kind of tree you could do that on. Little Jim always did stick up for a fellow when he was being teased. In a minute, Poetry acted like he was ashamed for having said anything. So he lay down in the grass and started picking flowers himself and sang, "Buttercups and daisies, oh the pretty flowers, coming ere the springtime to tell of sunny hours, while the trees are leafless, while the fields are bare." Only the trees weren't leafless and the fields weren't bare. Well, I finished my bouquet and ran home with him as fast as I could, little Jim going with me because he wanted to see the baby too. "What's her name?" he asked, panting for breath. "Charlotte Ann." "It's a pretty name," he said. "I wish I had a little sister." And right then I decided I liked little Jim an awful lot, almost as well as Poetry. When we got back to the gang, Big Jim was there, and we all lay around in the grass, talking about what had happened last night, and explaining to Dragonfly and little Jim that we couldn't help it, because they weren't there to get in on the fun. We all kept looking at Big Jim's sore knuckles, and kind of envying him for being able to hit the robbers so hard it almost knocked him unconscious. Then we all decided to go up to look at the sycamore tree and the big hole in the ground, and then Big Jim said we'd go up into the hills to see the cabin where Old Man Peddler used to live. Pretty soon we were all standing around the hole by that big swamp rose bush, and being glad the robber was safe in jail where he couldn't hurt anybody. We could see the grass all mashed down where we'd had our fight. Little Jim just walked around with a sober face, thinking, when all of a sudden he said, "I'll bet if I had been here and had got a hold of one of his legs, I wouldn't have let go." "He only had 2 legs," Dragonfly said, "and Bill and Circus had both of them." Little Jim looked disappointed for a minute, then his face kind of lit up and he said, "But I could have helped sit on him after you got him down, couldn't I?" Of course he could, I thought, but Dragonfly spoiled it by saying, "Not with Poetry sitting on him too. There wouldn't have been enough room." We all lay down in the grass, and Poetry and I told the whole story all over again, not forgetting to tell how ridiculous Poetry looked in his big flapping pajamas, with the long hair and whiskers on. Then Big Jim called a meeting and gave us a little talk about crime never paying. And he quoted a kind of scary verse from the Bible which says, "Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Then he explained that if anybody lived a sinful life, he'd have to suffer for it sometime, not only in this life, but in the life after this one. And he made us promise that we'd never, any of us, steal anything as long as we lived. When he got through, little Jim piped up and said, "One of the 10 Commandments says, 'Thou shalt not steal.'" When the meeting was over and we were on our way up into the hills, climbing toward Old Man Peddler's cabin, we felt as if we'd all been to church. And I kept thinking as we walked along about that beautiful sunset I'd seen night before last, with the sun shining through long-colored clouds, looking like a waterfall tumbling over a dam, with colored electric lights behind it, and how pretty soon those clouds changed so they looked like the bars of a jail. One of the clouds especially had looked like an old man with long whiskers. I kept thinking about Old Man Peddler, and wondering what he was doing up in heaven if he was there, which he was if he was dead, because little Jim had said that if people let Jesus into their hearts while they were alive, he'd let them into heaven when they died. Of course, my folks had taught me that too, a long time ago, but little Jim's saying it seemed to make it more true, he being such a good Christian. Well, we had a lot of fun climbing up to that old cabin, pretending Big Jim was the sheriff, and the rest of us were his posse, and we were going up to ambush a band of robbers who lived there. In about a half an hour, I reckon, we were close enough to the cabin to see it. So we all stopped and lay down in the grass and made our plans as to how we'd capture those imaginary robbers. It made us feel kind of creepy to remember that some people believed the old house was haunted. Of course, we knew that was because Old Man Peddler had just disappeared without anybody knowing what had become of him. Everybody finally decided he'd either drowned in the creek or else wandered too far off the path out into the dangerous part of the swamp and had sunk down into the quicksand. Well, we made our plans, sneaked around from tree to tree and from bush to bush until we were real close to the cabin, when all of a sudden Dragonfly said, "Psst," and we knew he'd either heard or seen something. We all stopped dead in our tracks and listened, and I guess my red hair must have stood right up on end. I think we had all heard it at once, a sort of low moan like somebody was trying to call for help, and couldn't, because his mouth was covered with a blanket or something. Chapter 11. I closed my teeth together tight to keep them from chattering, because I didn't want anybody to know how scared I was. I noticed Big Jim look around quick to see if Little Jim was there and all right. It was grand the way he looked after that little fellow. He couldn't have liked him any better if they'd been brothers, I thought. And I made up my mind that even if Charlotte Ann wasn't a little boy, I was going to like her just as much as Big Jim liked Little Jim, and I'd protect her and take care of her too. And thinking that made me so I wasn't nearly as afraid as I was just a half a minute before. We could see Big Jim was making up his mind to do something, for we could still hear that muffled voice in the cabin, calling for help. I kept thinking, what if whoever was in there was just trying to get us to come in, and then we'd be caught in a trap? But we couldn't afford to lie there waiting if somebody was really needing us. So pretty soon Big Jim told us to keep still, while he and Circus went to investigate. In just about a minute, we saw Circus standing in the doorway of the old cabin and motioning for us to come quick. And I tell you, it didn't take long to scramble to our feet and get there. What do you think we saw the minute we got in? There were only 2 rooms in the cabin, and on a cot in the corner of one was an old man with long white hair and whiskers, and with his hands and feet tied with strips of blanket. Big Jim was just taking a gag out of his mouth, which somebody had put there to keep him from calling for help, I suppose. He looked exactly like the picture I'd seen of Old Man Peddler, the picture Barry Boyland had given my pop in the hospital yesterday morning. Also, he looked like the robber we'd caught the last night before his wig and beard had come off. Water, the old man cried in a broken voice, and I thought of the map we'd found and of the picture of an old man in a bed asking us for water. Dragonfly looked around quick, found an old tin can on a table, and he and I ran out and down the hill to where we'd seen a spring on our way up. I wonder who he is, Dragonfly said, panting for breath. Old Man Peddler, of course, I said. But how can he be? He's dead. He doesn't look like it, does he? He's supposed to be anyway, Dragonfly said. In about 2 minutes we were back with the water, and the old man drank it like he hadn't had any for a long time, we being careful not to let him drink too much too fast, or it might not be good for him. Pretty soon he was sitting up in bed and thanking us boys for coming to his rescue. He'd been tied up here ever since yesterday, he said, and he hadn't had a drink since last night. Say, he had the kindest little gray eyes anybody ever saw, and you could tell by the way he looked at us that he liked boys. And that's how we decided he must be the real Old Man Peddler. You aren't a ghost, are you? Little Jim asked. You could see he liked the old man an awful lot. Little Jim always did like old people and was kind to them. That old man just laughed right out when little Jim said that. He told us he'd left the hills about 10 years ago and had traveled clear around the world, visiting many countries. Well, the old man said he had decided to come back home and live the rest of his life here in the hills. Suddenly, he stopped telling us about himself and looked around as if he were afraid. And that gave us an idea we ought to tell him about the robber being caught and his nephew getting shot and how his treasure was locked up in the big vault in the bank uptown right this minute, if it was really his treasure. So we told him, all of us helping a little bit. You should have seen the worried look leave his face. All of a sudden he said, I bet you boys are hungry. But we weren't. That is, we'd rather hear his side of the story first, how he happened to get tied up, and anything he wanted to tell us. I'll bet you're hungry, Circus said, and we began looking around to see if there was anything to eat. That robber we'd caught must have been living in an Old Man Peddler's cabin for quite a while, for he had laid in quite a supply of food, canned pork and beans, and corn, and all kinds of foods. Of course, Old Man Peddler himself had brought some when he'd come home yesterday afternoon. We carried in some wood and built a fire in the old stove and carried a kettle of water for him. I dug some sassafras roots yesterday just before coming home, he said, looking in a can on an old shelf, and sure enough he found some. How'd you boys like to have some tea? It's very good for boys. Sassafras tea, you know, is made from the sweet-smelling roots of the sassafras tree. The roots are kind of reddish color, and you cut them in little pieces and boil them in water till the water turns red. And with sugar in it, it beats any other kind of tea all to pieces for taste. Anyway, I think so. Little Jim had never tasted any before, and he said it was just like drinking lollipop juice. That is, if there was such a thing. I don't suppose I can tell Old Man Peddler's story like he told it, and maybe it'll sound more like me telling it than him. But I'll do the best I can, 'cause it's a real story. As I said, as soon as he heard about the robber being caught and put in jail, he didn't act worried anymore or afraid. So he had us sit down and listen. Big Jim sat on a chair with Little Jim on the cot beside him, and the rest of us sat or sprawled on the floor. The old man sat in the only other chair there was in the room, the one he'd made years ago himself, out of hickory mostly. Say, he looked just like one of the pictures of Moses I'd seen in my Bible storybook back home, my parents having bought me one with a lot of pictures in it when I was little. Old Man Peddler had been traveling around the world and visiting a lot of countries, staying maybe a month or two in each place. He was rich, you know. When he got thinking maybe he was too old to travel anymore, and if he died, he ought to do something with all the money he'd buried back in the hills along the old swamp. I guess if you'd seen us boys while he was telling us that story, with his kind old eyes looking at us as if we were his very own grandchildren, his long whiskers bobbing every time his chin moved, you'd have thought we all should have been named Dragonfly, because that was the most exciting story we'd ever heard, and our eyes were almost popping out of our heads. Well, anyway, they were wide open every minute of the story. When I got back from my trip around the world, the old man said, I was so tired I didn't feel very well, so I stopped down there by the old spring to get a drink and to rest, wondering if anything had happened to my cabin while I was away. I hadn't intended to stay so long when I left, you know. Then I looked up and saw smoke coming out of the chimney. Who's in my cabin? I thought. I hurried up the hill and pushed open the door, and there, sitting at my table and drinking coffee, was a man that looked almost exactly like me. It was just like looking at my twin, or else in a mirror, and I began to wonder if maybe I was losing my mind or something, being so old. Who are you? I asked, and the strange man just laughed and said, telling a lie, I'm Old Man Peddler, of course. What do you want? And he swore at me. Well, right away I knew I hadn't lost my mind, and that man wasn't me, because I didn't swear at all, hadn't since I was a little boy, and had let Jesus Christ come into my heart. You can't swear in my house, I told him. Well, that man stood up and glared at me, Old Man Peddler said, and then all of a sudden he grabbed me and pulled me inside and pointed a gun at me and shouted, I am Old Man Peddler, do you hear? And you're just a visitor. Come here. I'm going to cut your whiskers off. Well, I'm not very strong anymore, and I couldn't have done anything to protect myself, so all I could do was beg him not to. Anyway, he changed his mind and said he guessed he'd kill me and throw me into the swamp. Everybody thinks you're dead anyway, and we'd just as well let it be true, he said. First he tied me up and threw me on the bed, and then he got a mirror and came over to where I was and began looking into it. He'd look first at me and then into the mirror. I look exactly like you, he said gruffly. I'm certainly glad you came home, so I'll know exactly how I'm supposed to look. He looked at himself in the mirror and laughed again. I had to admit he looked just like me. I kept lying there wishing my nephew would come. You see, about a week before I came home, I'd send a letter to my only living relative out in California, telling him to please come to see me, as I was getting old and had a lot of money to give him before I died. In that letter, I told him where he would find a map that would explain where I buried my money, so in case anything happened to me before he got here, he'd know where to find it. I explained the map also, just in case he wouldn't be able to figure out what the different things meant. The old man stopped a minute while we all sighed, waiting eagerly for him to finish. That map, you know, was the one we'd found in the old sycamore tree the day before yesterday. Well, the old man went on with his story while I shifted my feet to a more comfortable position, one of them having gone to sleep because I was sitting on it. My twin stood there, glaring at me, trying to decide what he'd better do with me. And I tell you, boys, I'm an old man, and I thought maybe my time had come to die. So I just shut my eyes and started praying, and telling the Father in heaven I was ready if he wanted me. Then I remembered again all that money I'd buried and was going to give my nephew, and maybe he wouldn't even get my letter and the money would be wasted. In my travels around the world, I'd seen so many places where missionaries were needed, and I'd thought that maybe in a few minutes I'd be in heaven, seeing Jesus face to face, and he'd ask me why I hadn't used some of that money for missionary work. Then the old man went on with his story. Well, the robber heard me praying, and it made him angry. Shut up, he shouted, and raised his fist like he was going to hit me. So I did stop praying out loud, although I kept right on praying silently, knowing God could hear anyway, and telling him I was ready to die, because I knew he'd sent his son Jesus to save me, and I believed on him in my heart. All right, Grandpa, the fierce-looking man said roughly. Let's get those whiskers off, or shall I take you out somewhere and bury you? He came over to me and took hold of my beard and gave it a little jerk. Then he laughed roughly and said, They're real whiskers, all right, and your hair is genuine too. I lost a wig and beard just like the one I have on now, down by the swamp a few days ago, and I may need another before I leave this country. He stood there looking at me as if he were trying to think of some way to get mine off so he could use them himself in case he needed them. I could see he was a wicked man and might do anything. And with his gun pointing straight at me, I began to think how I might save my life for a little while at least, so I said, "Maybe you'd like to know where my treasure is buried." The old man stopped talking again and poured himself another cup of sassafras tea. Then he went on with his story. All the time I was hoping my nephew would come, yet afraid to have him come because he might get hurt. So I told the robber where to dig, and he must have decided to let me live a little while longer, for he put a gag in my mouth and went away, leaving me all tied up like you found me. Just as he went out the door, he said, "Listen, Grandpa Paddler, if you've lied to me, I'll come back, and you can tell this world goodbye." And that was the last I saw him. The old man sighed like he was tired of talking. Anyway, that was his side of the story, and you know what happened after that. How the robber had seen us boys digging there by the rose bush, and that night had come back himself, and we had captured him. Well, we boys thanked him for telling us the story, and promised to come back and see him again, and maybe we'd go see his nephew and tell him his uncle was alive and well, and not to worry. He thanked us over and over again for coming to untie him, and then we left. Down by the old spring where Dragonfly and I had gone for water, we all lay down one at a time and drank, horse fashion. Then we turned around and looked back up at the cabin with the blue smoke rising slowly up out of the chimney, and with the old man standing in the doorway, his long white whiskers shining in the afternoon sun. All of a sudden, he lifted his hand and waved goodbye to us. No, he had both hands raised, like one of the pictures in my Bible storybook where an old prophet was raising his hands to bless somebody. And for a minute, I thought of the funny cloud I'd seen the other night, which looked like an old man with long gold whiskers reaching down to his waist. Then we started down the hill toward home, not forgetting to stop at the swimming hole for a good swim, so we could tell our folks we wouldn't need a bath tonight, this being Saturday, and all boys having to take a bath on Saturday night, whether they want to or not. Some of us had to take them even oftener than that. That is the end of our chapter for this evening. I will see you again tomorrow night, and we will continue on with chapter 12.